The moment I stepped into the grand hall, the truth hit me like a punch to the chest. This wasn't a birthday party. It was a carefully orchestrated public execution, with 30 smiling faces turned toward me, each one complicit in the performance of humiliation. The chandelier above cast a golden glow over the marble floor, glinting off crystal glasses filled with champagne that smelled sweet enough to mask the underlying tension, but not enough to erase it. My parents stood at the center, grins stretched wide, eyes sharp with anticipation, like predators savoring the moment before the strike. My father raised his glass, a conductor signaling the final note of a cruel symphony. "Simone," he said, his voice loud, deliberate, carrying across the room like a gavel striking the bench, "you are officially disinherited." Laughter erupted, a chorus of delight and mockery that cut into my chest. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I let the sound wash over me, filing each detail, committing every expression, every smirk, every glint of cruel satisfaction to memory. Inside, a cold, sharp fury took root, growing stronger with every toast, every whisper, every moment of their delight. I didn't respond. The best revenge isn't immediate, it's inevitable. I moved toward the exit with deliberate calm, each step measured, each breath steady. The music swelled behind me, a cheerful jazz that mocked the horror unfolding in the room. Guests turned their heads, wondering why I wasn't reacting, but I let them believe they had won. I didn't need to. By the time I reached my car, parked under the soft glow of streetlights outside the estate, my plan was already forming. Calls were made, alliances activated, dominoes set. Every laugh, every toast to my misfortune, became fuel for the unraveling I would orchestrate. My parents' hubris, my family's arrogance, would become the chains that bound them to their own downfall. Weeks passed, and the consequences unfolded with a precision that felt almost surgical. Their mansion went into foreclosure, the cars they flaunted were repossessed, the friends who had toasted to my humiliation avoided my gaze. Every day, I watched from the distance I had carefully maintained, and with every unraveling, I felt a strange, exhilarating lightness. It wasn't satisfaction, it was freedom. I had been untethered from the manipulation, the constant judgment, the suffocating expectations that had defined my life for decades. The world felt quieter, cleaner, sharper. 6 months later, I found myself in a small bistro in Boston's South End, a world away from the gilded halls of the Ritz-Carlton where my life had once been dictated by others. Warm lighting, exposed brick walls, the subtle aroma of garlic and rosemary, it smelled like authenticity. Jamal, my steadfast ally, sat at the table, a glass of deep red wine in hand. Beside him were Sarah, the prosecutor who had taken my parents to task, and David, the U.S. attorney who had signed the warrants. They weren't my family by blood, but they were mine in every meaningful sense. Loyalty, integrity, shared values, these were the threads that bound us. For the first time in 34 years, I wasn't bracing for disaster. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was simply Simone, and that was enough. Midway through the meal, my phone buzzed. A name appeared on the screen that hadn't surfaced in 6 months, Mom. The table went silent. Jamal's glance told me everything. I wasn't alone in understanding what this meant. I stared at the phone, imagining the attempts at manipulation, begging, pleading, threats, or perhaps a combination of all three. My hand moved deliberately, my fingers steady as I silenced the ring, scrolled to the bottom, tapped, block contact, and confirmed. The line went dark. The bridge wasn't merely burned, it was obliterated. The rubble was cleared, erased from memory, erased from the future. I raised my glass of sparkling champagne, bubbles catching the light, and looked at my friends. Everything was perfect. Quietly, calmly, I allowed myself to feel it, liberation. Relief. Power reclaimed. I thought of the nights of study by candlelight, of the days carrying trays, the sting of insults disguised as jokes, the bitter taste of betrayal, and how each moment had been a lesson, a brutal education that had forged resilience, focus, and clarity. Justice, I realized, isn't a destination. It isn't a gavel, a sentence, or a prison cell. Justice is a practice. It is the choice to stand when you wish to sit, to speak when silence is tempting, to protect yourself when others attempt to diminish you. I thought of Harrison Sterling in his cell, of Ebony wiping tables, of my parents working menial jobs, and of myself, sitting in the sunlight of my life, entirely free. Justice sometimes requires patience, sometimes it demands a measure of cruelty. I raised my glass to a cleaning lady I had watched years ago, humble, dignified, resilient. My friends echoed the gesture, understanding without explanation. The night was young, the city sparkling, the balance restored. True power doesn't need an audience, it is quiet, relentless, unyielding. When toxic people attempt to use you as a stepping stone, the greatest revenge is to step aside and let them fall. To live a life they can no longer touch. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to save your future? I asked softly, the rhetorical weight hanging in the room, for anyone willing to listen. Share your story in the comments, like and subscribe for more, and remember, sometimes silence is your sharpest weapon. After dinner, I stepped out into the crisp Boston night, the streetlights reflecting off the thin layer of frost on the sidewalks. The city smelled of rain, asphalt, and something raw, freedom. I walked slowly, letting the cold bite at my cheeks, savoring the clarity that came with it. Every step reminded me that I no longer answered to anyone's expectation but my own. 6 months ago, I would have run in fear from the shadows of my parents' control. Now, I walked through them as if they were nothing more than whispers in a dark corridor, powerless against the light I had built around myself. I decided to take a detour, driving past the old family estate. The mansion was silent, the grand windows dark. A foreclosure auction sign leaned crookedly on the lawn. My parents' cars were gone. Their friends were gone. The people who had laughed at my humiliation had all moved on, leaving the empty structure to mark the end of an era. I sat in the car for a long moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. It was more than poetic justice, it was the embodiment of patience, strategy, and inevitability. Every insult, every snide comment, every public slight I had endured had been meticulously catalogued, remembered, and ultimately, used as fuel for my triumph. The next morning, I returned to the courthouse to finalize the last of the financial settlements. The halls were quiet, mostly empty of the bustle I had grown used to during hearings and trials. I walked past the security checkpoints with a casual nod to the guards who had once kept me safe from chaos, now watching as I moved confidently, untethered by fear or resentment. Jamal met me at the entrance, carrying a stack of files. He had already coordinated the credit bureau notifications, ensuring every fraudulent account, every manipulated ledger, would be erased from my record. "All done," he said, a small smile playing at his lips. "History corrected. You're clean." I stared at him, seeing the man I had doubted 6 months ago, the man I thought had betrayed me for a few $1,000s. But he had been playing the long game, a master of patience, a silent guardian of the truth. Every step he had taken had been precise, every risk calculated, every move part of a larger plan I had only begun to understand. He wasn't just my clerk, he was the instrument of my liberation, the quiet force that had allowed me to turn years of suffering into a testament of resilience and cunning. Days passed, and I slowly re-entered a world I had once thought I could never belong to. Invitations to events, professional gatherings, even social dinners came my way, but I approached each one with caution, knowing that my power was no longer in wealth or appearances, it was in knowledge, patience, and control. I began accepting only those opportunities that aligned with my vision, my ethics, and my new understanding of justice. And always, I observed. Always, I watched. Because the same people who had tried to diminish me were still out there, still believing that they could manipulate life's currents to their favor. I knew better. One afternoon, I found myself seated in a quiet cafe, reviewing documents related to Harrison Sterling's remaining assets. Even in prison, his legacy was crumbling, piece by piece. His former associates were facing subpoenas, and his network, once untouchable, was unraveling. I allowed myself a small smile, realizing that patience had been my ally. The slow, methodical dismantling of his empire mirrored the precision I had applied to reclaiming my own life. Justice was not a moment, it was a practice, a pattern, a series of deliberate choices executed over time. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, absolute clarity. Later, I received a call from a law school friend who had always doubted my resolve. "Simone, I hear everything's changed," they said, voice tinged with awe and disbelief. I didn't boast. I simply said, everything changes when you stop giving away your power. It was the truth. Everything I had endured, every slight, every manipulation, every public humiliation, had become a tool. Not for revenge in the petty sense, but for transformation. For liberation. And as the sun set over Boston, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, I felt the weight of the past finally lift. That night, I hosted a small gathering at my apartment, not to flaunt victory, but to celebrate the quiet, steady reclaiming of my life. Jamal, Sarah, David, they were there, laughing, sharing stories, lifting glasses to one another. We spoke of the future, of possibilities, of the choices that make life meaningful. We didn't speak of the past, not because it didn't exist, but because it no longer had power over us. I glanced at the snow falling gently outside, coating the city in white, and felt a profound sense of balance. The scales had finally tipped. I had taken nothing, I had only stopped giving. And that, I realized, was enough to dismantle the walls built by arrogance, greed, and entitlement. I continued because the story wasn't finished yet, not even close. Victory is never just a moment, it's a process, and the real reckoning always comes after the silence settles. A few weeks later, the invitation arrived in my inbox with a tone so polite it was almost laughable. A charity gala. Black tie. My parents' former social circle would be there in full force, the same people who had clapped while I was disowned, who had smiled as if cruelty were entertainment. The message said they were honored to invite me. I knew what it really was. Curiosity. Damage control. A desperate attempt to see whether I had truly risen or whether I was still the same girl they could dismiss with a glance. I accepted without hesitation. The night of the gala, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not out of insecurity, but intention. I chose a simple black dress, elegant and restrained, the kind that didn't scream for attention but commanded it anyway. No flashy jewelry. No need. Power doesn't announce itself. When I arrived, the valet handed me a ticket and froze for half a second when he read my name. That pause, that recognition, was delicious. Inside, the room glowed with chandeliers and practiced smiles. Conversations dipped as I passed. Whispers followed. Some people recognized me immediately. Others needed a moment. But eventually, it clicked for all of them. I felt eyes on my back as I moved through the room, calm, unhurried. I stopped to greet a few acquaintances, people who had once pretended not to know me. Now they laughed too loudly, praised my work too enthusiastically, as if proximity alone could redeem them. I let them talk. Silence, I had learned, was often the sharpest weapon. Halfway through the evening, I spotted my parents across the room. They looked older. Smaller. The confidence they once wore like armor had cracked. My mother clutched her purse as if it were a lifeline. My father avoided eye contact, pretending to be absorbed in conversation. They hadn't known I would be there. That much was obvious. Then came the announcement. The host tapped the microphone and asked for everyone's attention. The room quieted. Tonight, he said, We are recognizing an individual whose work in public service and justice has had a profound impact. A pause. My name echoed through the hall. I felt the shift immediately, the collective intake of breath, the subtle shock rippling outward. My parents turned in unison. My mother's face drained of color. My father's jaw tightened. I walked to the stage, every step measured, grounded, unshakable. I spoke calmly. I didn't mention them. I didn't mention the disinheritance, the party, the humiliation. I spoke about accountability. About truth. About the quiet strength it takes to rebuild when the people meant to protect you become your greatest obstacle. I thanked mentors. Colleagues. Friends who stood beside me when it would have been easier to look away. The applause was thunderous, but what mattered more was the silence from the corner of the room where my parents stood, frozen in the wreckage of their own choices. Afterward, my mother approached me, trembling, her voice barely steady as she said my name. For a moment, I saw the version of her I once loved, the illusion, at least. She apologized, softly, vaguely, without ownership. I listened. When she finished, I simply said, "I hope you find peace." Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Peace. Then I walked away. That was the moment I knew I was free. Not because they were punished, but because they no longer had access to me. Months later, life settled into something quieter, richer. I moved into a new home overlooking the water. Mornings began with sunlight instead of dread. I mentored young women who reminded me of who I used to be, brilliant, underestimated, carrying invisible scars. I told them the truth no one told me early enough: you don't owe loyalty to people who weaponize love. You don't owe silence to those who humiliate you. And you don't need revenge when clarity will do far more damage. On my next birthday, there was no grand party, no audience waiting to see me fall. Just a small table, close friends, laughter, and peace. As I blew out the candle, I didn't make a wish. I didn't need to. I had already given myself everything I was once denied. Respect. Autonomy. Dignity. And the final truth settled gently in my chest, undeniable and complete. Sometimes the most devastating comeback isn't loud or cruel, it's living so fully, so freely, that the people who try to destroy you are left as nothing more than a footnote in a story they no longer control. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been humiliated by the very people who were supposed to love you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories are for the ones who were underestimated, discarded, and silenced, and rose anyway. Share your story in the comments. You're not alone, and your ending is still being written. Weeks after the gala, I found myself invited to speak at a law conference, one I had long dreamed of attending but never imagined as a platform for my own voice. The auditorium was massive, glass walls spilling sunlight onto polished floors. I walked in with quiet confidence, past crowds of ambitious young lawyers, journalists, and academics, each unaware that the woman stepping onto the stage had survived something far uglier than any case they'd ever argued. I paused at the lectern, let the silence linger for a heartbeat, and then began to speak, not in triumph, not in vengeance, but in hard-earned clarity. I told them about the importance of integrity, of accountability, of having the courage to dismantle injustice even when it lives inside your own home. I didn't speak about my parents by name, but everyone there felt the weight of the story, the tension in every carefully chosen word. Their murmurs grew, rippling outward, because the truth resonates whether you want it to or not. Afterward, the attendees came forward one by one, shaking my hand, sharing stories of betrayal and struggle, asking questions, seeking guidance. I listened, nodded, offered insight, and in those hours I realized something profound: my story had become bigger than my pain. It was a lesson in power, and it was contagious. People left that auditorium carrying fragments of my resilience into their own lives. And I understood, for the first time, that my worth was not measured by the approval of the people who tried to break me, but by the impact I could leave on strangers who believed in justice and courage. Late that evening, when the crowd had gone and the stage lights dimmed, I walked backstage and took a quiet moment to myself. I held the lectern, feeling its smooth wood under my hands, and thought of the kitchen where I had once been sent to clean. I thought of my parents' whispers, their smirks, their misguided confidence that they could shame me into submission. I smiled, softly, almost imperceptibly. The power they had imagined holding over me had evaporated entirely. I wasn't just free, I was untouchable. And the world was finally seeing what I had always known: my life, my dignity, and my triumph were mine alone to command. In the following months, offers began to pour in: guest lectures, mentorship programs, media interviews. I was careful. I chose only the spaces where my voice would be heard, where my message of justice, courage, and unwavering dignity could resonate without compromise. I wasn't seeking revenge anymore. I was cultivating influence, legitimacy, and respect. It felt cleaner, sharper, more satisfying than any scorn I could have exacted on my parents. Their humiliation had been real, their downfall public, but mine was private, controlled, and enduring. One crisp December morning, as snow blanketed the city in a soft, white hush, I walked to my office with a sense of completeness I had never felt before. The courthouse, once a symbol of obligation and frustration, now felt like home. Every step I took through its halls reminded me of the nights I had spent studying by candlelight, of the sting of my parents' words, of the laughter of friends who had stood by me, of Jamal quietly orchestrating justice behind the scenes. I thought about Ebony, my sister, wiping tables in the Ritz-Carlton, her fate now dictated by her own choices, no longer able to harm me. I thought about Harrison Sterling in federal custody, his empire crumbled, and I felt the satisfying justice that came from time and truth, rather than fury. That evening, I sat down at a small dinner with Jamal, Sarah, and David. We poured sparkling water into crystal glasses and toasted quietly, without fanfare, without the need to proclaim victory. It was an intimate celebration, a recognition of the battles won and the peace achieved. I looked at them, my chosen family, and understood that this was what real success looked like: calm, steady, and unapologetically yours. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to humiliate. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. The world had already recognized the strength I carried, and the silence, the patience, and the relentless commitment to my own dignity had done what anger could never achieve. And as I left the restaurant, walking into the sparkling city lights dusted with frost, I felt it fully: the last chains of my childhood, my parents' expectations, and every insult they had thrown at me had broken completely. I was free. I was Simone Carter, federal judge, survivor, and architect of my own destiny. The check had been paid, the lesson learned, and the final chapter was mine to write. Every choice I made, every quiet act of resilience, had compounded into a life that they could never touch, never undo, and never understand. The world stretched ahead of me, clean, ordered, and waiting for my next move, and for the first time, it belonged entirely to me. The night my parents tried to destroy me on my birthday. The night began like any other, or at least that's what I was told. My parents, smiling with that practiced charm that hid everything, had invited 30 of our so-called closest friends to what they called a celebration. I arrived, dressed sharply, expecting laughter, cake, maybe even a few surprises that come with birthdays. But the moment I stepped through the door, I felt the air shift, a heavy, calculated tension that prickled my skin. The smiles weren't for me. The chatter wasn't meant to include me. It was a stage, and I, apparently, was a prop. My parents had spent months planning this, carefully coordinating a spectacle of humiliation. By the time I realized what was happening, the whispers were audible, the smirks were sharp, and the final blow landed like a punch to the gut: a public disinheritance, announced to every single guest in the room, my name echoing with cruelty, as if they had rehearsed this moment specifically to break me. I remember standing there, frozen, my mind spinning with disbelief. They had cut me out of the will, declared me unworthy of a single dollar, all while pretending to celebrate the day of my birth. Friends gasped, a few tried to offer polite condolences, but most didn't know where to look, too shocked to intervene. And I realized something terrifying: the people I trusted most had orchestrated a betrayal not in private, not in whispers behind closed doors, but in front of everyone I had ever known. It wasn't just a financial blow, it was a message, a lesson in their version of power. My hands trembled, my vision blurred, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone in a crowd. The party, the laughter, the music, all of it was a weapon. I could have shouted, I could have caused a scene, but I didn't. I smiled, quietly, and walked out. Outside, the cold air hit me like reality itself. The city lights flickered, oblivious to the storm in my chest. I realized that their celebration, their grand display, had underestimated one thing: me. They thought humiliation would silence me, would bend me to their narrative of control, but they were wrong. I had survived, and survival is only the first step. I called Jamal, my loyal confidant, the man I had once doubted, the one who had quietly orchestrated justice behind the scenes while keeping me safe. He answered with calm certainty. "It's time," he said. And I knew that for every insult, every stolen moment of dignity, every lie they had told about me, there was a reckoning coming. In the following weeks, I meticulously dismantled their power piece by piece. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to confront them in front of the world, though the temptation burned like fire in my veins. I let the law, the evidence, and the truth do the work for me. Every forged document they had signed in my name, every fraudulent loan, every attempt to manipulate my life for their gain, I exposed it all. The bankers, the federal agents, the attorneys, I made sure the network of their lies unraveled precisely as it should, leaving no room for error. And when the dust settled, when the final judgment came down, it wasn't just a legal victory. It was poetic justice. My parents were forced to face consequences they had spent decades teaching me to fear. And yet, the most satisfying part wasn't watching them fall. It was watching myself rise. I rebuilt my life with the precision of someone who had survived a war and emerged unbroken. I drove my own car, simple and unpretentious, knowing I could have anything money could buy but choosing integrity over flash. I dined with friends who had proven their loyalty, celebrated victories that weren't mine alone, and felt, for the first time, a profound, unshakable peace. The world outside had changed, yes, but more importantly, I had changed. I was no longer a child in the shadows of their ambition. I was a federal judge, a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, a person who had turned every insult into a stepping stone toward freedom. The climax of my journey came not in courtrooms or with loud declarations but in silence and subtlety. I walked into the Ritz-Carlton months later, the site of previous betrayals, and found my sister Ebony, once arrogant, once cruel, serving drinks, worn down by the weight of choices she had made and consequences she had ignored. She froze when she saw me. For a heartbeat, I saw her remember everything: the mockery, the unfair advantage, the life she had assumed was hers by right. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I placed a single $20 bill, the one Harrison Sterling had thrown at me, on her tray. "Keep the change," I said quietly, the finality of my words heavier than any scream could have been. I turned and walked out. And in that moment, I understood the truth of power: it is quiet, it is precise, and it is absolute when wielded without need for spectacle. And now, as I reflect on the journey from that fateful birthday to this evening, I realize something deeper: justice is not a destination. It is a practice, a daily choice, a decision to stand firm when every instinct tells you to bend. It is in the silent victories, the calculated patience, the courage to cut toxic ties, to let arrogance crumble under its own weight while your life rises. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not public humiliation or dramatic exposure, it is living fully, freely, and without compromise, while the world watches and learns that your life belongs to no one but you. The weeks after the party blurred together in a haze of research, strategy, and quiet observation. I didn't just sit back and hope the world would correct itself, I orchestrated it. Every interaction, every meeting, every phone call became a step in the dismantling of the empire my parents had built on manipulation and deceit. I wasn't vindictive, I was meticulous. I documented everything: receipts, bank statements, emails, even the faintest hints of conversations that hinted at their intentions. Every lie they told about me, every attempt to cover their tracks, was preserved, waiting for the moment it would serve its purpose. I was patient. I was deliberate. I was learning that justice is a game of endurance, and I had already outlasted everyone else at the table. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment overlooking the city, I revisited the memory of that birthday, the faces of friends turning toward the spectacle my parents had engineered, the laughter that wasn't meant for me. The memory was sharp, but it no longer hurt. Instead, it fueled a determination that was colder, harder, and far more precise than anger. I realized something essential: they had tried to humiliate me, but in doing so, they had revealed themselves. The arrogance, the entitlement, the expectation that the world would bow to them, they had shown their hand. I simply had to play it correctly. And I did. The day the federal investigation concluded, I walked into the courthouse with my head high. My parents were there, sitting with their lawyer, their faces masks of forced composure. I didn't glance at them. I didn't speak. I let the process unfold, watched the law execute itself with the cold efficiency it had been designed for. When the final judgment was read, it was precise: restitution, probation, community service, and, most importantly, distance. They were forbidden from contacting me, their privileges stripped, their pride shattered. The irony wasn't lost on me: they had spent years teaching me to fear consequences, yet they had never considered that the law might reach them, too. And now it had. In the quiet aftermath, I rebuilt myself, not with money or possessions, but with control over my own story. I surrounded myself with those who had proven loyalty, those who had seen my struggle and had chosen integrity over convenience. Dinner with Jamal, Sarah, and David became a ritual, a reminder that family isn't always defined by blood, but by trust, shared values, and mutual respect. We laughed, we celebrated, we reflected, and in those moments, I realized the full extent of my freedom. I could breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. I could move forward without hesitation. I was not just surviving, I was thriving. But the final lesson, the one that would resonate forever, came in silence. Months later, I encountered Ebony, my sister, once a figure of privilege and arrogance, now a reflection of the choices she had made. Seeing her in the Ritz-Carlton, serving drinks, a shadow of the person she had believed herself to be, I felt no desire for vengeance. I didn't humiliate her, didn't announce her failures to the world. I simply placed a single $20 bill on her tray, the same bill thrown at me years ago, and said quietly, "Keep the change." That small act spoke volumes. Power isn't proven by destruction, it's proven by restraint. Justice isn't loud, it's undeniable. And so, I learned the ultimate truth: silence is often your sharpest weapon. You don't have to scream, you don't have to fight back immediately, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone who underestimated you. You gather your evidence, you let the arrogance of others undo itself, and you rise above. The world will notice in time. Your dignity, once stripped, can be reclaimed in ways more permanent than any shouted confrontation. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply living a life they can no longer touch. As I sit now, looking out over the city, I realize that justice is not a single moment. It is a practice. It is patience, strategy, and the courage to act when the world expects you to remain silent. It is the choice to stand firm when everything tells you to bow. It is the quiet victories, the careful dismantling of lies, the reclamation of your name, your credit, your life. And most importantly, it is knowing that when you walk away, truly free, the world will never hold the same power over you again. Months had passed since the final courtroom judgment, and life had begun to taste like freedom. I woke up without dread, without the constant, heavy pull of my parents' schemes pressing down on me. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and sunlight, the city below sparkling like a promise I had earned. I reviewed my emails, answered a few calls, but mostly I allowed myself the luxury of doing nothing, simply existing in a world that no longer sought to humiliate me. And yet, every so often, a memory would surface, the laughter at my birthday party, the smirk on my mother's face, the prideless applause from my so-called friends. It was sharp, but no longer unbearable. I had survived, and I had won. Then came the evening at the Ritz-Carlton. I had dressed carefully, emerald velvet hugging me like armor, my hair loose but deliberate, diamonds catching the soft light. I had a dinner reservation with Jamal, Sarah, and David, not for strategy, not for work, but for celebration. The moment I walked through the lobby, the scent of pine and champagne filling my senses, I felt it, the world had shifted. It no longer operated on my parents' terms. It no longer demanded that I bow or fear. And there she was, Ebony, my sister, once so untouchable, now serving drinks, head down, hands shaking as the weight of reality pressed on her. Our eyes met, and the air between us thickened with unspoken history. I could have called out her failures. I could have humiliated her as she had tried to humiliate me for years. But I didn't. I let her see me, not as a sister, not as a judge, but as someone who had endured, who had quietly collected every piece of evidence, every betrayal, and transformed it into empowerment. I placed the $20 bill, the same one Harrison Sterling had thrown at me years ago, on her tray. "Keep the change," I said softly, letting the finality of those words echo louder than any public spectacle ever could. She looked up, tears forming in her eyes, recognition, shame, and comprehension all at once. She had finally understood. Walking out into the crisp winter night, I felt the cold air hit my face, sharp and cleansing. Snowflakes kissed my cheeks, melting quickly, as if even nature wanted to erase the traces of past humiliation. I hailed a taxi, slid into the back seat, and for the first time in decades, allowed myself to simply breathe. I thought about the journey, the sleepless nights, the humiliation, the endless scrutiny. And I realized the ultimate truth: surviving the cruelty of others is not enough. Real victory is building a life so untouchable that their interference no longer matters. It is silence, patience, and deliberate action. It is reclaiming your story and never letting anyone else write it for you. Back at my apartment, I opened a bottle of champagne and raised a glass, alone but not lonely. "Here's to zero debt, zero drama, zero Sterlings," I whispered to the quiet room. The victories were small, cumulative, precise. Every document signed, every law upheld, every piece of stolen dignity recovered, these were the milestones of a life rebuilt. Justice had been served, not with screaming or spectacle, but with patience, evidence, and action. And the most powerful lesson lingered: sometimes, the best revenge is simply living a life they can no longer touch. As the night deepened and the city lights shimmered below, I thought of my parents, of Ebony, of Harrison Sterling, and even of myself. Each had been a piece of a larger puzzle, a test of endurance and strategy. I had emerged, scarred but undefeated, aware that real power doesn't need to be announced, it's lived. And as I sipped the last drops of champagne, I knew the story wasn't just mine. It was a message for anyone who had ever been underestimated, silenced, or oppressed. Your silence, your patience, and your diligence can become your greatest weapons. You can rise above, reclaim your dignity, and live a life untouchable. If you've ever been crushed by a family betrayal, manipulated by toxic relatives, or underestimated in your own home, remember this: you have the right to protect your future. Share your story in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow more journeys of resilience, empowerment, and justice. Sometimes the world will try to step on you, but your response doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be effective. And that, my friends, is true power.